Welcome to the fifth program of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan's 2022 eight-session Great Decision Series with topics suggested by the Foreign Policy Association. I'm Michael Vendetta, and I'm the Executive Director of the Council. On behalf of my colleagues Erica Kubik and Rachel Brooks, the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, I welcome all of you. Thank you for adjusting with us as we program responsibly during these uncertain days of COVID-19, and we hope that you will stay safe and show grace to those in your community. Council's mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do that with the support of nearly 50 local companies, 11 colleges and universities, and many, many community members. Together, we seek to provide programming that is credible, objective, relevant, civil, and connecting. To change the world, we believe, one must first know the world. And you can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. Tonight, we say thank you to Wolverine Worldwide as our series sponsor, to Blue Lake Radio and the Community Media Center as media sponsors, and to Montcalm Community College as topic sponsor. After Dr. Lopez's presentation this evening, there will be ample time for questions. That time of Q&A will be moderated by myself and by Council Board Member Bo Torres, who is a Latinx community advocate. You may type your questions into the YouTube comment section, or you may text them to 616-308-6560. And as always, we ask you to exhibit civility to our guest and hospitality to others by asking respectful and succinct questions. We are pleased to have Dr. Mark Hugo Lopez with us, and we are grateful to him for his flexibility to engage us in this format. To introduce our speaker tonight, I turn it over to Mr. Bo Torres. Bo?
Thank you, Michael. And it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Mark Hugo Lopez. Dr. Lopez is the Director of Race and Ethnicity Research at the Pew Research Center, where he leads planning of the center's research agenda focused on chronicling the diverse, ever-changing racial and ethnic landscape of these United States. He is an expert of issues of racial and ethnic identity, Latino politics and culture, the U.S. Hispanic and Asian American populations, global and domestic immigration, and the U.S. demographic landscape. Lopez was previously the center's Director of Global Migration and Demography and of Hispanic Research. Lopez is the co-editor of Adjusting to a World in Motion, Trends in Global Migration and Migration Policy. He is the co-author of The Future of the First Amendment and has contributed chapters to several books about voting and young Latinos. Prior to joining the Pew Research Center, Lopez served as a research assistant professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and as research director of the Centers for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, or CIRCLE. Lopez received his doctorate in economics from Princeton University. He is an author of reports about the Hispanic electorate, Hispanic identity, and immigration. Lopez frequently appears in national and international media, both in Spanish and in English. His presentation tonight is titled International Migration Has Shaped U.S. Demographics. We welcome Dr. Mark Hugo Lopez.
Great. Thank you very much, Bo, for that wonderful introduction. And Michael, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And it's great to be here and to get to talk to you about some of the work at the center that we've done. I have a short presentation to share with you some demographic trends and some public opinion findings from our surveys about the way the U.S. public views the nation's changing demographics. But also, I wanted to say thank you to everybody for being flexible with me. I had initially planned to be in Western Michigan for this presentation, but was unable to do so because of some family events, but also COVID-19, although in retrospect, I didn't think Ukraine was going to be on the list as well. So thank you for your flexibility and letting me do this virtually. So let's get started. I have some slides to share. First, let's see, let me share my slide. There we go. So I'd like to talk to you about the role that international migration has played in shaping the nation's demographics. And if you're a student of demography, you've probably been following a lot of the results coming out of the U.S. Census over the course of the last couple of months. The Census Bureau has released new information about the 2020 census, how many Americans were counted, some of the nation's changing racial and ethnic composition. And all of that is really interesting in light of what changes since 1965 have done to the nation's demography, particularly as policy changed the ways in which people came to the United States. And since 1965, we've had about 59 million immigrants come to the country alone. And that's really interesting because it puts the US as a standout worldwide when it comes to the number of people who were born in another country but are living here in the United States. But before I get started on that, I want to give you some sense of who we are at the Pew Research Center, because I think it's important to keep in mind who the Pew Research Center is. And we are what we like to call a fact tank. That means we're a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization. So some of you may ask me questions about what might need to be addressed in immigration policy, for example, and I might say, I don't know, because we have no positions on policy and can't make recommendations, but I will share with you some of our public opinion findings and try to share with you data on what the public thinks about what are the priorities, say, for immigration policy, or what the public thinks about the nation's changing landscape of demography. So keep that in mind when you're composing your questions, and maybe some things I'm unable to address because of our nonpartisan, non-advocacy stance. So what do we know? Well, first, the nation's 2020 census showed that the population of the country reached 331.4 million people. This is, of course, a record high. The US population continues to grow, and it's actually up 7% between 2010 and 2020. This is about an additional 22 million people or so. And what's really interesting here is that the nation's population, again, continues to grow and grows faster than it does, say, for some other countries around the world, some other prominent developed countries like Japan, say, or Germany or Italy. So the US, by comparison, is growing faster. Yet this was the slowest population growth in a decade that the country has seen since the 1930s. So that's pretty interesting and both pretty striking, because we've been seeing US population growth slow over the course of the last few decades. Now, this is at the same time that we've seen some other big changes in terms of the nation's demography, one of which is the country's become much more racially and ethnically diverse. And at the same time, immigrants have made up a growing share of US population growth. Keep all of that in mind, because the story of demography since the 1960s over the last half century has really been one that has been shaped by immigrants and their arrival in the country, and this in spite of a slowing population growth story for the country overall. So what do we know in terms of this last decade? Well, interestingly, as I noted, the US population grew by about 7%. That is 22 to 23 million additional people living in the country today compared with a decade ago. Where did this growth come from? Well, about half of the growth in the nation's population over the last decade has come from Hispanic population growth. There's an additional almost 12 million Hispanics living in the United States between 2010 and 2020. Now, this is not new. Hispanics have made up more than half of the nation's population growth over the last 3 or 4 decades. And that's really been an important and striking component of the nation's population growth story. It's really been one that's been driven by Hispanic population growth. In addition, there was a growth in the Asian American population, and a 23% growth over the course of the last decade. And frankly, the Asian population is growing faster than the Hispanic population in percentage growth terms, even though the Hispanics added twice as many people as Asian Americans did over the course of the last decade. But still, the bulk of the nation's population growth was driven by Hispanic population growth and Asian population growth, the two largest immigrant populations in the United States, or I should say, the two groups that have the greatest number of immigrants. Followed by Asian Americans are Black Americans, who also saw population growth and accounted for about 10% of the increase. But white population growth, and this is white non-Hispanic single race people. So these are people who say their race is white alone, and also tell us that they're not Hispanic. That population is the largest in the country of any one of these racial or ethnic groups by far. But it is also the one that saw a decline in its numbers, a decline of about 5 million people. But keep in mind the group that I'd mentioned who this is. This is white, single race, non-Hispanic people. If we take all people in the country who say that they are white, whether they're Hispanic or not, or whether they're multiracial or not, the white population in the country did increase over the last decade. However, when you take a look at it as just among white, single race, non-Hispanic people, that number declined. And this is what most of the news media has really focused on, is this decline in the nation's white population. The first time we've seen that in I think ever in the country's history. It's really a striking number given where a lot of the growth is coming from, that is from Hispanics, Asians, and Black Americans, while we see the white non-Hispanic population declining for the first time in the country's history. All this, of course, has implications for the shares of the population that are different racial or ethnic groups. And you can see here, since 1980, what the combination of the racial ethnic combination of the country has looked like over the course of the decades. Today, 58% of the nation's population is white, 19% Hispanic, 12% Black, 6% Asian, and 5% a group of other different combinations of groups. This includes people who are multiracial, who are Native American, who are Native Hawaiian, who are Pacific Islander, or who might say that their race is some other race. But interestingly, the nation, as you can see, has become more diverse over the course of the last 4 decades. Since 1980, the share white has dropped from 80% of the nation's population to 58%. And again, this is white and non-Hispanic single race people, the usual group that most social scientists think of when they think of white Americans. But of course, many Hispanics might also say that their race is white. So keep in mind that racial identity and Hispanic identity and multiracial identity are also part of the story. And I want to come back to that later, because people, the public, I don't think considers itself or thinks of itself in these very stark social sciencey, you're one or the other type of group. There's a lot of overlap. And that's something that I don't think is quite usually taken into account when we look at some of these numbers. This change in the racial and ethnic composition of the country is reflected also in changes around the country at the county level. And you can see that there's a growing number of counties where Hispanics, Blacks, or Indigenous people are the largest racial or ethnic group in the country. I would also add that there's some where Asian Americans are becoming the largest racial or ethnic group in a particular county in places like Hawaii or in Northern California. That's on the verge of happening. But what's striking here is that we are seeing a growing number of counties where the single largest racial or ethnic group is not only the largest, but also the majority of the population in those counties. And you can see the distribution of this around the country with this map here showing data from 2018. So those are some of the big demographic trends that the 2020 census revealed, that the Census Bureau has talked about. Where does immigration play in all of this? And why is immigration so important for the United States? Well, first, how many immigrants live in the United States? Well, 45 million. So about 45 million immigrants live in the country today, which makes the United States the single largest, the United States has the single largest population of immigrants of any country in the world. Our projections at Pew Research say that by 2065, that number could be upwards of 78 million people who were born in another country living in the US. Of course, because the country is so much bigger today, there are just more immigrants in the country today than there have ever been, but that's because of the size of the nation's population and the world's population overall. But you can see where the number of immigrants stood back, say, in 1900 in the early 20th century, a period thought of as the peak of immigration from Europe for the United States, at least in terms of when we think about the stories of different waves of migration to the United States from Europe over the course of the last century and a half. Now, when you take a look at this in percentage terms, which is perhaps a better way to think about this, you can see that the nation is approaching 14% of its population as being foreign-born. So that's almost about one in 7 Americans were born in another country. You can see it's not quite the historic high. That was in 1890 when the nation was 14.8% foreign-born. But this number is a number that has been rising since the mid-60s. And this is when the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act was passed, which eliminated a lot of the quotas that were in place and that were limiting the amount of people who could come from different parts of the world to the United States. This was particularly important for Asia, but also economic circumstances have changed, and the reasons why people come to the country have also changed. And so we have a shift in the sources of immigration, at least in the last 50 years, where people are coming from. But the changes in the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act were very important in opening the door to a different flow of people, a different flow of immigrants coming to the country than had been the case before. And that's what we see happening over the course of the last 50 years, is that has contributed to the growing diversity of the country. But let me also show you not only that immigration has been rising and that immigrants are a bigger share of the US population, but how important immigration has been for the population growth numbers of the United States. So the first chart on the left from 1965 to 2015 shows you two lines. The top line shows you the actual population numbers, historically speaking, and the bottom line shows you what those numbers would have been without immigration. So by 2015, 50 years after the 1965 law was passed, there would have been a 72 million people difference in population for the United States had there not been any migration between 1965 and 2015. That's really quite striking. So virtually all of the nation's population growth since 1965 has come from the arrival of new immigrants to the country or the birth of children to those immigrant parents in the United States. That's a really striking number when you think about it, but it points to the importance of immigration for US population growth. Now, we also did some projections back in 2015, and looking at the next 50 years, we projected that what would happen if the United States had continued migration patterns like we'd seen. We would reach about 441 million people in 2065, but without immigration, that number would be about 338 million. So very interesting set of charts here showing the importance of immigration for US population growth. But keep in mind that this projection was based on a time when we were talking about more migration than we've been seeing in recent years because of COVID and so forth to the United States and also Donald Trump. All of that has had a lot to impact people's decisions to come to the United States. Even so, immigration has played a key role and an important role in driving population growth for the country. What about that diversity? Well, here are the three waves of immigration that have come to the US since the mid-19th century. And you can see that the composition of the origin countries for people has been very different in each one of these waves. In the earliest wave, the Northern European wave from 1840 to 1889, that was a wave that was largely driven by Northern and Western Europe. Think about Germans, for example. Think about people from Ireland. In the 1890 to 1920 wave, you'll see that that's largely a Southern and Eastern European wave. Think about Polish immigrants, immigrants from Greece, from Italy, and Portugal. Those are some of the biggest sources of immigrants in this particular wave in the late 19th, early 20th century. More recently, it's a very different story. Half of the immigrants who've come to the United States since 1965 are from Latin America, about a quarter are from South and East Asia, and only 12% are from Europe. This is really a very different combination of people than was the case back in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And it's really been an important driver for the racial and ethnic composition of the country that we are seeing today. Also, where are immigrants from? What are the top countries in terms of birth countries for today's US immigrants? Well, Mexico by far is the single largest. 11.2 million of that 45 million or so are from Mexico. The next largest immigrant population are people who trace their origins to China, then those who trace their origins to India, the Philippines, and El Salvador. But as you can see, it is largely a Latin American and Asian story in terms of the 5 largest immigrant groups in the country today. This has also had some very important implications for the demography of the nation in terms of immigrant generations. And if you take a look here at sort of where the country is at, and this is both historical, but also based on some of our projections to 2065, you'll see that today, about 14% of the US population may be born in another country, but there's about another 10, 12% who are the US-born children of immigrant parents, so that in total, 26% of the nation's population, 1 in 4 people, are either immigrants themselves or the US-born children of immigrant parents. Now, that's not a historic high. Back in 1900, that number was at about 35%. So 35% of the US population back in 1900 was either an immigrant or the US-born children of immigrant parents. which is a striking number because that means that about 1/3 of the U.S. population at the time had an immigrant connection or an experience growing up in an immigrant household, which is really a big number, 1 in 3 Americans. When you take a look looking forward, by 2065, we expect to see numbers that are very similar to what we saw in the early 1900s. That is, about 1/3 of Americans by 2065 will either be immigrants themselves or the US-born children of immigrant parents. So those are just some demographics. Let's talk a little bit about what the US public thinks about this, because the Pew Research Center's work is oftentimes focused on public opinion data. So the first question that we've put to the public recently is one about diversity. Is the increasing diversity, that is, with people, is it good for the US to have a population that is made up of people from many different races and ethnicities? Is that a good thing for the country? Bad thing for the country? What does the public think? Generally speaking, 3/4 of Americans say, hey, it's good that the country is more racially and ethnically diverse. There's a real sense across all different racial and ethnic groups, all different education levels, all different income levels, and also different political affiliations, that this growing diversity has been a good thing for the United States. So in general, the public sees growing diversity as good for the country. Even among Republicans, you have 2/3 who say that it's a good thing for the country on net. So that's great. But when you ask about some specific parts of this, there are some interesting patterns. So first, when it comes to the impact of many people from people of many different races and ethnicities making up the US population, what impact has it had on the nation's culture? Generally, the US public says it's had a positive impact. 64% say there's been a positive impact on US culture as a result of all this growing diversity. But at the same time, we have found in our surveys that about half of the US public says that growing diversity has made it harder for policymakers to solve the country's problems. Now, this is particularly true among Republicans, 56% say that. Among whites, 52% say that. But this is a large share of the US public, almost a majority, about half, who say that it has become harder for policymakers to solve the country's problems because the country is now more diverse. Now, also, it's important to keep in mind that 45% of the US public says that it doesn't make much of a difference in terms of being able to solve the country's problems. This increasing diversity is not a problem for policymakers. But 47% say it has become harder for them to solve the nation's problems because of the country having much more diversity, racial and ethnic diversity. We've also asked about whether or not the public thinks it's a good thing or a bad thing that there's a declining share of white people in the United States. Well, on net, Americans generally say it's neither good nor bad. But interestingly, when you take a look at younger Americans, 29% say it's at least somewhat good that there's a declining share of white people in the United States. And when you take a look at, for example, Republicans, you'll find that about 1/3 say that it's either somewhat bad or very bad that the share of the population that's white is declining. So some interesting different points of view about what the declining white population share of the United States means for US society overall. What about the views of immigrants themselves? Well, also this is quite interesting because we've been tracking this for a number of decades now, back into the 90s, and there's been a reversal in public opinion on the view of immigrants. Today, Americans are more likely to say immigrants strengthen our country through their hard work and talents, but back in the 90s, about the same share said that immigrants were a burden to the country because they took jobs, housing, and healthcare. So when you take a look at the impact or the views of immigrants that Americans have, the share that have a positive view, or at least one that they see them as strengthening the country, has really shifted. It has become more positive in the view of immigrants and their contributions to US society, and less negative. And this is true, by the way, across the board in all different demographic groups of Americans, even though there might be some differences between some groups. With all of that, what does the public think about, though, immigration policy? So what are the priorities, say, for example, for dealing with what's happening at the US Southwest border? So this is from a survey from last year in 2021. We asked a whole range of different questions, but as you can see, there's a desire on the part of the public to boost staff and resources, but also to reduce the number of asylum seekers coming to the country. So when we ask about some specific immigration policy questions, you do see somewhat specific preferences on the part of the public for what they would like to see happen with regards to, say, immigration policy at the US-Mexico border. And in addition, when we ask about whether or not undocumented immigrants should have a way to stay here in the US legally, if they meet certain requirements, you can see that generally speaking, the public supports that. But we've seen a decline in the share of Republicans who hold this point of view over the course of the last few months. Now, how does the U.S. compare in terms of its immigration trends with the world as a whole? And what's happening at the world level? Well, globally, there's about 281 million immigrants worldwide. That is, people who are living in a country other than that of their country of birth. This doesn't take into account what's currently happening in Europe with Ukraine, and it also doesn't take into account a lot of what's happened since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. So keep in mind that these numbers are from 2020, prior to those two events. The numbers would be higher. But as you can see, the number of people who live in a country other than their country of birth has been on the rise. In 1990, that number was 153 million. By 2020, it was 281 million, according to the United Nations. Some important global trends to keep in mind. It's about 34 million of that 281 million back in 2020 were refugees or asylum seekers. So they make up a significant share of the global migrant population. About 3.6% of the world's population were migrants in 2020, but that was up from 2.8% in 2000. Top destinations, the US is the top destination, but Germany, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the UK are also in the top 5. And what are the top source countries? There are more migrants from India than any other country in the world. So more Indians live outside of their country of birth than any other country has people outside of their country of birth. Mexico is next, followed by Russia, China, and Syria. Of course, these origins could change now with everything that's happening in the world. And some of the fastest growth since 2010 has not been in Latin America. It's actually been in the Middle East and been in North Africa. That's where we've seen more new immigrant populations emerge. So Latin America for a while was the biggest source of new immigrants in the 80s and 90s, but that really has shifted in recent decades to now the Middle East being an important source of new immigrant growth worldwide. This gives you some sense of sort of how big Latin America was in the 1990s and in the 2000s, but has subsequently fallen behind other regions as a source for new migrants worldwide. Returning to the United States, when we talk about immigrants in the United States, we also talk about their legal status. And among those 45 million or so immigrants, you'll see that maybe about 23% are what we would call unauthorized or undocumented immigrants. These are people who are in the United States without authorization. The Pew Research Center has been estimating this number for years, and we estimate that it's about 10.5 million at the moment, or again, 23%. But most immigrants are in the United States legally. In fact, about half are actually naturalized citizens. Another quarter are people who are legal permanent residents. So most immigrants in the United States are people who are either here legally and have achieved citizenship, or are people who are here legally and have a green card, and maybe they want to become a US citizen, maybe not. There's a number of reasons that people may choose not to become a US citizen. And there are also many temporary lawful residents as well. But the vast majority of people who were born in another country and who are living in the United States today are in the United States legally. I also wanted to share with you one other interesting factoid. And by the way, if you ever go with me to dinner or a cocktail party or coffee, I'm probably going to give you a lot of factoids because I work at a fact tank. One important factoid here, I think, is to note how big the number of college-educated immigrants is in the United States, how big that number is. We have 14.7 million college-educated immigrants. This is among people ages 25 and older who have a post-secondary diploma or degree. The next largest number is from Canada, followed by the UK, Australia, Germany, etc. The reason why I bring this up is because the competition for college-educated immigrants is on the rise. Many countries around the world are looking to compete with the United States to attract the most educated immigrants around the world and to get them to come to their countries rather than coming to the United States. This is partly about people coming to the US to study or versus another country, or partly about attracting, for example, high-tech workers to come and work in a particular country. Now, the US, of course, has a much larger immigrant population. So as a share of our immigrant population, only about a third have a college degree. But in Canada, that share is about 2/3. So by comparison, some countries have more of their immigrant populations with a college degree in terms of percentages than does the United States. So it's something important to keep in mind, but it's an important fact to also be aware of when we talk about the policy preferences of countries and who they want to have, who they want to invite as immigrants to come and live in their countries. At the US-Mexico border, there's also been an awful lot of interest in what's happening recently. We've had a record number of encounters at the US-Mexico border in the last fiscal year 2021, about 1.7 million encounters. Now, keep in mind what encounters are. Encounters are not necessarily individual people. Sometimes it could be families, sometimes it's unaccompanied minors. Sometimes it's the same person who the Border Patrol may have encountered more than once. So there's some double counting in here, and there's some groups that are counted as single encounters, but are not necessarily the number of people. Even so, the Border Patrol is encountering more people than it ever has at the US-Mexico border. And this is in terms of going back all the way back to the 1960s. And that's really a striking number. We're seeing a growing number of people coming from Ecuador, from Brazil, from Nigeria, from Haiti that are entering and appearing at the US-Mexico border who want to enter the United States, in addition to Mexico and Central America being big sources of immigrants as well among this number of people who are encountered at the US-Mexico border. So some real striking changes in the last couple of years as COVID has begun to recede. Finally, where does immigration fit as a priority for the public? Well, at the beginning of 2021, we asked the US public about what was the most important priority for the president and Congress to address. And you'll see that immigration is far down the list. Strengthening the economy and dealing with the coronavirus outbreak at the time were seen as bigger concerns for the country than dealing with immigration. And what about as a foreign policy goal? You'll see that for the US public, immigration has really not been a top foreign policy goal. And this is likely still the case with everything happening in the world today. But back in 2021, it was not seen as an important US foreign policy goal by the US public. Other things such as protecting the jobs of American workers and dealing with the spread of infectious diseases were seen as more important foreign policy goals for the country. I'm going to stop there. That was a lot of data. I'm sure there are lots of questions, but I look forward to our conversation. And I want to say thank you again for the flexibility and letting me come and present to you and to do so virtually today. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lopez. Wow, that was a lot of information to digest, but fascinating. Every single slide had some surprising things to me, at least, about what data really tells us. So thank you for that. You may ask a question of Dr. Lopez. You may do that in a couple of ways. The YouTube chat box will get your question over to us as moderators, or you may text them to 616-308-6560. And I am sure there will be plenty of them. I'll turn it over to Bo to ask the first question or two to get us started. Bo?
Thank you, Michael. And great presentation, Dr. Hugo Lopez. Really insightful. So as we're talking about younger Americans, and as we're talking about the demographic shifts that are happening, when we were getting to know each other a little bit earlier, we started talking about language and how that shapes and how that develops a sense of identity. So when we're talking about the shift from Hispanic to Latino, Latinx, Latine, and how that has made our populations grow and differ in the way that they see themselves, how do you see that changing the demographics of the country and identity?
Yeah, it's a great question because the terms and the labels that we use to describe ourselves have changed over the decades. You can see it all the way back to 1790 in the first census. So in the first census, the ways in which Americans were described as white and black and so forth is very interesting and different than, say, the way that we do today. So some terms have come and gone. Like, for example, when it comes to Hispanics, we started really capturing people who are of Hispanic or Latino origin in 1980. That's when the census first had a question about, are you Hispanic or of Spanish origin? That's how it read. And then you had an example of, are you Mexican, Puerto Rican, et cetera. By the 1990s, there's a discussion that we need to add Latino to the list. So by 2000, you have the question reading, are you of Hispanic or Latino origin? And more recently, if you've been following the ways in which people of these origins talk about their backgrounds, you'll find that the population is now starting to talk about things like Latinx and Latine as alternatives to Hispanic and Latino when it comes to describing the group overall. First off, what is Latinx? So not everybody may know. Latinx is a gender-neutral term meant to describe the nation's population of people who trace their roots to Latin America. This is an alternative to Latino or Latina, and it's meant to be gender neutral. Latine is something that's emerged in Latin America, similar to Latinx, to also be gender neutral. So you replace the A and the O in Latino with an X or an E. These terms, though, also have proven to be both controversial and contentious for some. And we've done some surveys of the US public of people who trace their roots to Latin America, or the Hispanic, Latino, Latinx population. And we have found that, for example, when you ask the adult population of Hispanics, Latinos, Latinx people, you'll find that most have not heard of the term Latinx. So Latinx is a term that's risen in popularity among some, but the general public is unaware of it. About 3/4 of Latino adults tell us they have not heard of the term Latinx. And when our surveys over the years, and we've asked about what labels people prefer to describe themselves in this population, we find that Hispanic is preferred by far over Latino, which is preferred by far over Latinx. And to give you some numbers, about 60% of adults in this population prefer to use the term Hispanic to describe the population. About another 30% or so say Latino was the preferred term. And then just 3 or 4% will say Latinx is the preferred term. And then there are other terms that people mention as well. But that is both interesting and striking to me. It shows you that, yes, new terms emerge, but it does take time for these terms to become popular and used by the public. One last point. If you were to go back to the 70s, when Hispanic was starting to emerge as a term used to describe the population, you did a survey, you'd probably find that many people hadn't heard of it, and many people were unaware of it and just really didn't know what to think about it. So who knows if Latinx or Latine, new terms to describe the population, might eventually emerge as quite popular in the coming decades.
Thank you for that. And in that same vein, when we look at the different relationships that we have globally, living in Michigan, having the privilege to have lived in Hamtramck and in Detroit, Michigan, you see those intersections of not only race, ethnicity, but religion. So as we are seeing these demographic shifts and change, the immigration that's coming into Michigan, for example, how do you see that playing out in the demographics world?
So we do see it playing out in the demographics by, for example, in the case of Latinos, talking about Latinos again, that you see that the arrival of many Latino immigrants has meant that there's been the introduction of and the building of religious affiliations and religious institutions that are present in their home country. So, for example, the Catholic Church has seen growing numbers of congregations, partly because of the growing Hispanic population and growing Hispanic immigrant population. At the same time, though, we also see other religions seeing a increase in the number of adherents. So, for example, the number of people who are say of an Asian religion, or say who are adherents of Islam, you're seeing those numbers rise too. And in the case of Michigan, Michigan does have a very interesting immigrant mix. It has Latin Americans, but it also has people from Iraq, for example. And so you have an interesting combination of religious diversity that's different than, say, what you might see in New York City or than what you might see, say, in South Florida. But all in all, immigrants are bringing much of what they grew up with back home to the United States. Now, do their children, US-born children, continue to be adherents to those religions? I don't know. In the case of Latinos, we see many US-born Latinos choosing to be unaffiliated with any religion, which is kind of what many young Americans tend to say, is that they're not Catholic or Christian or Muslim or anything. They're just non-affiliated. But interestingly, many of those same young Latinos will have a shrine, say, to the Virgin Mary in their home because it's a cultural marker as well. So there's some very, very interesting elements and components to all of this. It's a little bit of the United States and the experience here influencing those young people, but those young people also bringing their families' experiences to their own, how they present themselves to the world. And that's what I find fascinating about all of this demography, is how we're seeing a mixing of ethnicities, religions, backgrounds, ancestries that are really creating an interesting fabric in different parts of the country.
Dr. Lopez, a question from one of the students at Devonport University, one of our 11 colleges and universities. How would you characterize the impact of anti-immigrant rhetoric from notable leaders or notable politicians in the U.S., but globally? But what do you see impact on that, on public opinion, and how does that drive the demographics?
It's a great question. So first, on public opinion, yes, there does seem to be an impact both in the United States and in other countries too, Europe particularly. So we've seen a growing number of people in the U.S., in Germany, in France, express the view that at the very least, there's a desire for no more immigrants to come. And of course, there could be other very strong, very negative, and very perhaps even racist opinions about immigrants as well that you see in the data when it comes to, say, for example, what makes somebody German? Well, you got to be born in Germany, you got to be Christian, and you got to be able to speak German. And even if you were born in Germany, but you aren't of German heritage, are you really German? Is a question that you might see some people ask about immigrants who've arrived, even people who were born in Germany and are third generation. So they were born there, their parents were born there, and their grandparents are the ones who made the move to Germany. They aren't necessarily considered German just yet by some. So yes, all of this can have an impact on the ways in which the public sees new arrivals from different parts of the world. But at the same time, around the world, in places where we see many immigrants arriving from countries in many different places, you do see a growing view, or a growing number of people hold the view that immigrants are important and strengthen countries. This is something we see happening in Europe as well. So there's a real emerging sense that Europe should take in people who are refugees, people who are looking for opportunity. And Europe has done a lot in the last 10 years to really change the way it admits people into the EU, for example. And that's really a different path than what we see here in the United States, where there's more of a talk of building a border wall, and also limiting the arrival of people from some specific or particular countries. Now, I don't want to say that Europe is necessarily doing things in a better way than the United States, because Europe too has its own border patrol, and Europe too has worked with countries to build barriers in North Africa to prevent people from coming north. So there are a number of interesting parallels as well between the way the US has worked with Central American countries to limit the flow of immigrants coming north, and the way Europe has worked with African countries to prevent people from coming north from sub-Saharan Africa. So very interesting set of patterns, but absolutely public opinion can be impacted by events, and also by the opinions of political leaders, and also by the ways in which we characterize people in popular culture.
Yeah, thanks for that. And the next question is a follow-up on that. In your career, can you recall any particular global or national events that have significantly impacted immigration perspective? So what are some of the largest drivers of immigration in terms of world events?
This is a really important question, because understanding the drivers of immigration is an important tool for policymakers, because then it'll give you a sense of what the policy levers might be to address some of those potential flows. So let's talk about what happened in Syria in 2014, 2015. That was an event which led to a large number of people leaving Syria and seeking refuge in Europe. And to see that particular flow of folks, and particularly the photo of a baby boy who had died and had washed ashore because a boat that him and his family are trying to get from Turkey to Greece had sunk. And so his body, he's face down on the beach. That was a particular moment that I think drew a lot of attention and shaped a lot of people's views about both policy, what should the EU do, and also the ways in which the public became aware of what was happening to Syrian migrants, Syrian refugees, particularly in their search to get to Europe. So that was one of those moments where I think there was an event where all of a sudden a large number of people are coming and seeking refuge in Europe. That particular photograph and the news stories around it drew a lot of attention. And that really, I think, shifted and shaped a lot of public opinion in Europe about being more open, particularly in Germany, to admitting about 800,000 people. In Sweden, I want to say they admitted something like 500,000 Syrian refugees, enough to shift the percent foreign-born in Sweden over the course of a year by about 1.5 percentage points. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's big for a country like Sweden, which has about the same share of its population that's foreign-born as we do. Another event that I think is an important one is what's happening now with Ukraine. So when you think about the Ukrainian, what's happening with Ukraine and people leaving Ukraine and seeking refuge in Europe, it's interesting that the two countries that have not necessarily been open to migrants from Syria, that is Poland and Hungary, have now become important entry points for people who are trying to get out of Ukraine and are now seeking refuge in Europe. And Europe has really made a point of providing services and help to those people, in addition to allowing them to move within the EU to find a refuge someplace else. So it's really interesting to see how this current crisis is yet another example of how something can suddenly happen and change the ways in which countries are engaging with each other on immigration policy.
Interesting. Yeah, that photograph, I can picture it in my mind. One photograph can make a difference, that big of a difference in public opinion. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's right. I think also if we think about here in the Americas, the story of immigration and people struggling to cross the U.S.-Mexico border, that too is something that over the years has been a very, very much in the public's mind. But it's also been polarizing. Some people say, well, hey, you crossed the border illegally, you can't be here in the United States. And then there are others who are saying, well, why are we making these folks illegal? They're not illegal, they're people. And they should be, we should reach out to them and try to help them. Generally speaking, I think the US public wants to help those who are in need, but the US public is also asking itself, well, why are folks coming? Are they coming just to work, or are they coming because they need protection and they need help? That's been at the heart of some of the U.S. debate about who should be allowed to come to the U.S. legally and not.
I have a question about, would you say more about the trends with African immigrants? Are there any particular shifts in immigrants from the continent of Africa?
Well, first to the United States. Thank you for asking, whoever asked this question. So to the U.S., we've seen a growing number of people coming from Africa. And so the number of immigrants from Africa who tend to be college educated or maybe even have graduate degrees has been rising and has been reshaping, for example, the nation's Black American population. Now, keep in mind, not everybody from Africa would self-identify their racial identity as Black, but many who are from Africa and who also identify as Black are reshaping the Black immigrant population in the US. And now about 1 in 10 Black Americans were born in another country. Many in Jamaica, many in the Dominican Republic, many in Cuba, but also African migration, particularly from Nigeria, from Ethiopia, from West Africa, has really been reshaping migration to the United States from Africa. But the story of African migration is really not just about coming here to the US. It's also about the role that African migration plays within Africa, and also the role that African migration plays to a place like Europe. So first, within Africa, we are seeing many countries in Southern Africa work together to create a region where people can freely move to pursue job opportunities in a way that is doesn't have a visa requirement, or it's easy to get the visa. So we're seeing most African migration happening within Africa. So yes, we talk about a growing number coming to the US. That's a small part of the total African migration story. We also talk about many going to Europe, and Europe has received many immigrants from Africa, particularly Morocco to France, say, or Spain, and also many Nigerian migrants to, say, the United Kingdom or other countries in Europe. So you do see a growing number of migrants heading to Europe as well. But again, the majority, about 2/3 of all people who are from Africa, from a country and born in a country in Africa, but live outside their country of birth, are within Africa. So people generally go to a neighboring country. So it's also striking, though, because when we talk about the future, the youngest continent in the world, is Africa. And so it's very likely that future waves of migration will likely be out of Africa more than anywhere else, or I should say, Africa may be best poised to have a population of people who may choose to migrate. Don't know if they will. And whereas Latin America will, by the end of the century, be one of the oldest regions in the world, even though it's really sent a lot of people to the United States, it's not the source or the engine of new immigrants that it used to be. Africa is poised to be that location. So we'll see what happens in the future, but lots of interesting questions about migration within Africa and out of Africa to other places.
And as we talk about these shifts globally, how does climate play into population shifts, right? As we're seeing a world in motion, we want to make sure that we acknowledge how climate is playing into these decisions to move into Europe, to move out of Africa, within Africa. How is that going to play into the roles of persons and food scarcity and those types of issues when it comes to migration?
It will play a role, and it already is in some parts of the world. You can see it in Central America, for example, in Honduras, it's playing a role there. But I don't think that any one factor is the single factor that drives people to move to another country, to make that decision to say, I'm going to go live someplace else. It's usually in combination with other things that are happening in that country. So for example, if there is limited economic opportunity, but then climate change has made things even worse, that may tip the decision on a person to decide to leave their country of birth to go someplace else. But there's no doubt that climate change will impact a lot of those decisions and will be a growing factor in driving migration around the world. We'll see how that plays out, but it's something that some say we're already seeing in the case of Central American migration to the United States, as there are more crop challenges and as there continues to be some political uncertainty in some parts of Central America. But all that coupled with search for economic opportunity, that together is perhaps enough for people to make that decision to head to another country, and not necessarily the United States all the time.
Dr. Lopez, you have a question from Western Michigan University, one of our partner schools as well. What do you know about the perceptions that populations in other areas of the world have with respect to the idea that diversity through immigration contributes or does not contribute to the nation? You showed us some statistics about the United States view of that. Do you have any information about what other countries in the world think about that same question?
It's a great question. Yes, we do at the Pew Research Center. We've asked about this, say, in Europe, because Europe's the other big destination in the world. And when you take a look in Europe, you do see a change in attitudes about immigrants, a growing share who say they have a positive view of immigrants, and a growing share that say diversity makes European countries stronger. Now, it depends on the country. You talk about different countries, like Hungary has a very different point of view on this than, say, the United Kingdom. But the United Kingdom is, of course, a country that not only receives a lot of immigrants, but also sends a lot of people to other parts of the world. You might know people who are from the United Kingdom who live in the United States who are immigrants here. In fact, interestingly, the United Kingdom is in the top 10 of sending countries and in the top 5 of receiving countries. Americans, people in the United States generally don't migrate out of the United States like we see in some other countries, particularly in Europe. So that's really, I think, just a striking example. But consider the case of the United Arab Emirates. And here it's really interesting. If you're a student of policy, there's some interesting policy discussions happening in the UAE. First, some facts. About 88% of the population of the United Arab Emirates was born in another country. So that means this is a country that has 88% of its population are immigrants. That's a pretty big number. And so some of the policy questions that you hear scholars talk about are questions about Are we losing our identity? How do we reverse this? How do we protect our identity? The very conversations that if we had them here in the United States might be perceived a particular way, a very conservative way, but there it is at the heart of some discussions about protecting the culture and the identity of people who are Emiratis. And that is, I think, an interesting conversation because it's a very different way of sort of thinking about immigrants. Also look at how in the UAE and in many of the Gulf states, immigrants to those places are treated. They're not part of the usual conventions around the world about having a standard in how we treat people who are international migrants. So for example, you might find that people end up having their passports taken from them. They work for a few years in order to be able to pay back the person who brought them or the company that brought them to, sorry, my camera, who brought them to the UAE. You might find that that company will be paid by the immigrant out of their salary in order to be able to then have the ability to return home to their home country. That is a very different model than what we do here in the United States or what is done in Europe, which, by the way, are very different models as well. And we haven't talked about Asia. China doesn't really accept immigrants. And when you talk about a country like Japan, which is a very homogenous country, it doesn't have immigrants either, you'll find that while there's generally the public is of the view that diversity is good, Japan isn't a very diverse country. And in South Korea, you have probably heard about some of the stories of migrants who have been placed on a particular island. I forget the name of the island, but they're African migrants who haven't been allowed to enter South Korea. Think about Australia. Australia has an island where many migrants are processed first before they're allowed to enter Australia. Some people can be stranded there for years. So when we talk about the story of immigration around the world, there are different models and different ways that countries do things, and publics have different points of views about diversity and about migrants. So the US is interesting and unique in its way that we tell our story about immigration, but ours isn't the only one. And there are different ways that people think about these problems around the world.
In the ways that people have been treated globally, we've heard a lot recently about the weaponization of different persons who are looking to leave their homes and come into different situations. Can you talk about that and how that has been shaping the way that migration has taken place in Europe, for example, with weaponization of specific persons from specific other parts of the globe?
Yeah, so there's been some discussion about the ways in which the migrants who come into Europe and the people who are allowed to leave their home country and head to a place like Europe is a way of weaponizing people to overburden a country or countries and place burdens on those services that are there, and also perhaps even destabilize a country by affecting the politics of that country. Some analysts might say that about a place like what happened in Europe in 2015 in countries like Germany and in Sweden, and the rise of political parties like the AfD, and I forget exactly how to say it in German, but it's a far right political group that has made closing German borders a key part of its policy platform in recent years, and has garnered support and had representation. I think they still do in the Bundestag, which is the house of Germany's government. So it's really interesting to see that, yeah, this some people do talk about this as sort of a way to weaponize migrant flows. Some might also talk about what happened with Cuba and the flow of people coming from Cuba during the Mariel boat lift in 1980 as another example of this. I don't know if people thought about it quite that way back then, but some analysts today might say that about the Mariel boat lift, which was a large flow of people coming from Cuba. So Fidel Castro let a lot of people leave Cuba all at once. There was a sense that maybe people had been in prison or in mental institutions, and that's who he was letting leave Cuba. But it's quite a wide variety of people because it was such a large amount of people. And yet the United States absorbed those folks. And yeah, it did create some tensions in South Florida. There was an English-only movement in South Florida at the time. There was a movement against speaking Spanish in public at the time. And that's where you start to see these English-only movements start in the United States. But that was back in 1980. Lots of very, very interesting stories here about this, but this is a great question. Thank you.
I had one listener, interesting, and you have so many surprising statistics in there. People are catching on to them. I really appreciate that. It's been a fascinating conversation with you. Someone noticed that Russia is in the top 5 countries, both for immigration and emigration. They were surprised by that. Any backstory to that? What's the analysis on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for noticing that. It's a little bit of, so Russia is a destination for migrants. So people from the former Soviet republics do go to Russia to work in energy and to work in science. And so there was a little bit of that. But also it's a little bit about the change and shift in borders. So many people who were in the former Soviet Union, who, for example, were living in the Crimea region of the Ukraine, when the Ukraine became a separate country, those people then were living outside of their country of birth. So they're counted as international migrants, even though they may not have moved there across a border. The border shifted at some point. So a lot of the Russian numbers that we see, both in terms of as an origin and as a destination, are coming from this change in borders that happened around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and as it became several other countries. It's an interesting question, something I've wanted to get a little bit more into the weeds on, but certainly one of the reasons that Vladimir Putin has used to invade Ukraine and places like Georgia and so forth has been about trying to protect those who are of Russian origin in those places.
A question from some of our colleagues in Grand Rapids Community College who are asking about the perception, the role of immigrants in agriculture and related agribusiness, meatpacking. We've heard a lot about that, especially during COVID and unprotected employees. Would you be kind enough to comment on the proportion of the workforce in this sector, the agriculture sector, that is made up of immigrants? Is it fair to say that immigrants are imperative for much of the U.S. food supply?
They're important. I don't know if I could say imperative, because they aren't necessarily the majority of workers even in that sector. It depends on the part of the sector we're talking about. So we're talking about people who are doing, say, some specific delivery drivers and so forth. Immigrants might be about half of that particular group's, that particular workforce's workforce. But generally speaking, they're not necessarily the majority overall of agricultural workers. Now, they are overrepresented in that particular sector. And so, yes, they're important to the production of things like food in the United States. But they aren't necessarily the only group in those occupations. Same thing is true about meatpacking. Same thing is true about construction. They're overrepresented in these. But there are some sectors where you do see immigrants are at least half, if not more, of the occupational category. And that would be things like people who work in nail salons, so personal care. And that is a reflection of some of the story around Vietnamese immigration, where many people established businesses. And so you do see, in some cases, in some very narrow occupations, where immigrants are maybe half of the occupational group, but it's not necessarily the case that in all of these that they are the only people working in those sectors. They're part of a broader workforce that includes people who are US born.
During this last administration, we saw a lot of conversations around additions or omissions to the census itself. So when we're looking at the makeup of the country, when we're looking at immigration, when we're looking at global movements, how do we see the census itself being added to? And what are some of the things that you would see or you would think would be added or omitted in the future from the census?
So in terms of omitted from the census, do you mean in terms of the questions that were asked, or in terms of the people who were counted?
The questions.
So it's great that you asked this, because, as you know, the census form changes over time. And if you look at the 2020 census, there's no question in there about where were you born. There's no question of, are you an immigrant or not? That's not part of the census. The census asks you, what's your gender, what's your age, are you Hispanic, what's your race? And there's a few other questions in there too, marital status. 10 questions is not a lot of questions. However, in the past, the census form used to ask people about where they were born. So we used to get that from the census, say in 1950, in 1940. So we did capture that information in the past. The census is a living, I don't want to say living document, but it's a living, It's a living census. In other words, meaning that it's something that is constantly changing. And we're always, you always will find that the public is asking the Census Bureau to consider new things, to take some things out and to change the way it asks about things. The last major rework of the census was in the 1990s, when the race and ethnicity, the race and Hispanic questions were changed and people could choose more than one race. Prior to 2000, you couldn't pick more than one race and you couldn't tell the public, the Census Bureau, that you were multiracial. Now the Census Bureau is thinking about the Middle Eastern North African category. It was a recommendation on the part of the Census Bureau to add that to the 2020 census, but it wasn't added. The Trump administration said, no, we're not going to add that. But that was a recommendation after years of research on the part of the Census Bureau to add a Middle Eastern North African category, because many Middle Eastern North African people will say that their race isn't white. They don't think of themselves as white, but that's what they're mostly classified as by the Census Bureau, or the examples suggest that that's what you should mark. And so there's been a movement to change that. But note what I said, it's a movement to change it. There are organizations that are working to add that to the census form for 2030. See if it happens. And there are other movements as well. People want to have a recognition of, or a place in order to indicate themselves. So the census form itself might change, but you know what else could change? And this is something that's really interesting when it comes to indigenous peoples, the Americas. You can capture the write-ins, because there's a lot of places you can write in your origins or your ethnicity or your background in the race question, say. The Census Bureau can tabulate that. It used to not tabulate indigenous peoples of the Americas outside of the United States. But in the last census in 2010, they did. So we got a sense of how many people say they're Mayan, how many people say they're Quechua in the 2010 census. I'm looking forward to what we're going to learn from the 2020 census, because there was one huge change. And I think this is important for how we think about ourselves as Americans. And that is that for the first time in the census, on the question about race, if you say you're white, you can write in your background. You can write in you're Irish or German or whatever you want to write in. And on Black, you could write in that you're Jamaican or Nigerian or Ethiopian. So we're going to be able to have a sense of how people see their ethnicities and their backgrounds in a much richer way than we ever have on something as big as the census. I'm looking forward to that. But this is, again, a reflection of both the desire to make this reflect how the public thinks of itself, but also how the public wants to be counted. There's a movement to change things as well. And that's one of the really great things about the census. One last thing about the census, I don't know if you know this or not, but the US is one of the few countries that actually does a complete census. Many countries have shifted to they don't do censuses anymore, like the Netherlands and Denmark. They don't do censuses anymore. They actually use what they call the registration card, or the registration information of their citizens. So to receive benefits, you have to register with the government. That means they're counting people who stand up to say, yes, I am Dutch and I want to receive benefits because I live here and I want to get my card. But if you're undocumented or an unauthorized immigrant, you may not want to do so. So the US Census tries to capture people who are in the country who are undocumented. But in some of these other countries, we actually don't know how many unauthorized immigrants there are, because there's no census. There's not even any complete surveys anymore. A lot of them are statistical estimates based on registration cards. That's an important distinction to keep in mind. So the census is a really both valuable, interesting thing, but also a unique thing that the United States does.
Oh, very interesting answer. Thank you. From our online viewers, is there any research that shows where most Latin American immigrants move within the region? You talked about African immigrants moving to neighboring countries or whatever. The questioner asks, most specifically, immigrants from Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela.
So when you take a look, it's a great question. We do actually have some data on this, and you can get a good sense of this from UN data. But when you take a look at, say, for example, immigrants from Mexico, about 95% come to the United States. It's a pretty high share. It's right next door. Perhaps it makes sense, right? When you think about Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, you'll find that about 90+% are coming to the US. Nicaragua, I want to say that it's about It's about 3/4 to the US. Of all people who've left Nicaragua for some place, they've come to the US, but a significant share have gone to Spain. And when you talk about Ecuador or you talk about the Dominican Republic, you'll see that while the majority have gone to the US, there's at least a third or so who have gone to Spain. And then in South America, Argentina is a destination and Chile is a destination. So Peruvians and Bolivians tend to go to Chile and tend to go to Argentina. You have Brazilians who tend to go to Uruguay. So there's a lot of inter-regional migration. Again, it's not like everybody just goes to the United States or to Europe. But the U.S. does loom large in where the immigrant populations of these countries go. What about Venezuela? Well, Venezuela is interesting because Venezuela has had a recent outmigration of people who've left Venezuela are now in Colombia. So you have a lot of interregional migration. In fact, most Venezuelan immigrants are in South America, but you do have a significant share who are in the United States. The thing that's interesting there is that the U.S. has tended to attract college-educated middle-class Venezuelans. And so if you go to South Florida, will see there's a lot of Venezuelan entrepreneurs, but that's a reflection of who's deciding to come to the United States. Whereas Colombia has taken in many people who just crossed the border who are in many ways classified as refugees or asylum seekers by international organizations.
Question about a listener who found it interesting and positive that the U.S. has more college-educated immigrants than other economically advanced countries. I think Canada was second, and wondered about the cause of that. Is that our higher education system? What's happening there that draws that particular group to the U.S. and Canada? And then you mentioned other countries were going to start to compete, perhaps, and how might they do that?
So this is a great question. It's a really fun question too. So first off, the 45 million immigrants in the United States, about a third have a college degree or higher. About a third have a high school diploma or less. So keep that in mind. We have quite a distribution of educational attainment among our immigrant population, more so than other countries. Canada may have fewer college-educated immigrants, but Canada is a smaller country. So as a share of its immigrant population, 2/3 have a college degree, whereas only 1/3 of ours have a college degree. So Canada has maybe not attracted as many immigrants as we have because it's smaller, but as a share of its immigrant population, it's attracted a more college-educated group. So how has this happened? How has the U.S. ended up with so many college-educated immigrants? Partly it's our universities and our educational system. It is one of the best. Some may even say it's the best in the world, but it's one that definitely has a lot of opportunity and has sought to recruit people from around the world to come and study in the United States. International students are an important part of the university experience in the United States. But the U.S. has also had a lot of companies that have sought workers with specific skills. So the U.S. has also attracted many immigrants who have technical skills, specific skills, high-tech skills. And so you see the H-1B visa program being a very important way that many college-educated immigrants come to the United States. This is particularly true of Indian immigrants. It's also true of many immigrants from places like China, from South Korea, from Germany. We attract a lot of people to the U.S. through the H-1B visa program who are people with technical skills and people who have a college degree. I'd also say that the U.S. has a very some might say it's a system that needs to be overhauled, but it has a very interesting immigration system. We have many different kinds of visas. So there's an H-1B visa, but did you know there's an agriculture visa as well? And did you know there's an entertainment visa? And did you know there's a special visa for scientists? And there's a visa for this. It's an alphabet soup of visas. But what it speaks to is the diversity of ways in which people can come to the U.S. It's almost as if the U.S. system is one that has all these different opportunities. It isn't quite as focused as some other countries, but that's why we have such a diverse set of educational attainment experiences among our immigrant population. We, in many ways, are seeing the world reflected in our immigrant population in a way that, say, Canada has been focused on just college-educated people. So now, how do countries compete against the U.S. on this? Because many countries do want those college-educated immigrants. And what you see some countries do is something like in the UK for several years. If you had a PhD and you were at least not too old, like I think I might be too old and they won't take me, or is that Canada? One of the two countries wouldn't take me. But if you were to go to that country as a PhD, you could say, look, I have a doctorate in economics, I have technical skills, and the UK would say, great, come on in. And you know what? You don't have to have a job for the first 6 months. We'll help you. We'll even give you some resources to help you get settled. Look at how different that is to the way we do it in the US. How do you come into the US with a technical skill? Well, a company has to want you. You have to have an H-1B visa approved in order to be able to come to the US. You have to have the visa before you come. The UK is saying, oh, you have the degree, come on anyway, come find a job, it will help you. Canada also does something similar, trying to encourage people to come and settle in Canada. So that's one of the ways in which you'll see countries might compete with the United States, is by changing the ways in which they get people to enter the country, making it easier for particular groups of immigrants. But you know what I wonder? I wonder, as we move forward, where is the competition for immigrants going to be greatest? Right now, it's really in immigrants who have technical skills or are college educated. But I wonder if we might have a need for immigrants with a different set of skills. For example, nurses as countries age. What about people who are going to be working in things like agriculture or manufacturing, again, as countries age? So could the competition for immigrants change in the future to be one where countries are competing for people who are like nurses or who are farm workers in a way that hasn't been the case recently? And that's where my comment earlier about Africa could be really interesting. Africa could be poised to really benefit from much of this competition, not only for technical and college educated people, but also people who have other skills like nursing or construction or farm or agriculture. So stay tuned. I think there's going to be some really interesting policy stories here, and there's no guarantee that the U.S. will continue to attract the most technical and college educated immigrants.
Wow, Dr. Lopez, this has been fascinating. I'm going to give Bo the last question, and then we'll wrap up. Bo?
So in that same thought experiment, what would be the one thing that you would change when it comes to immigration and policy here in the US?
Well, I have no positions on policy, so I am nonpartisan, not advocacy. However, I would say that the one thing that I think would be very useful as a researcher to be able to have more information about is better data about immigrant generations. I know in the United States, we talk a lot about disparities by racial and ethnic group, disparities by gender, and disparities by socioeconomic status. But I think the one that's been overlooked to a large extent, because the data isn't quite there to the same degree, is immigrant generation. So what I mean by that is, where were you born? Where were your parents born? Where were your grandparents born? As we see a growing number of Americans being the US-born children of immigrant parents, or somebody born in another country but who came here very young, grew up here, but kind of also has those roots in the home country. I think that knowing about immigrant generation will be important. And we can get it from some Census Bureau data sources, but it would be very interesting to have that on, say, the decennial census, or on some of the bigger data collections. There are some researchers, by the way, who are pushing for this, but that would be very interesting to see happen. Not that I'm recommending it, but if it was there, I'd use it.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Lopez, for being with us tonight. This has been fascinating. We could go on and on and on. There are more questions that are in the queue, but we don't want to abuse your time. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And our next speaker expert in the Great Decisions series will join us on Monday, March 14, Mr. Rick Rassa, who is a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. He'll be discussing with us India and the Quad Alliance. And that'll be at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in person at the ATC Center of Grand Rapids Community College, or online at our YouTube channel. You could go to worldmichigan.org/greatdecisions22 for more registration details. Thank you for being with us tonight.